we're living in a time in which capital has been globalized. Now we're living at a time in which nationalist populisms have been globalized. We're living in a time where ideas move very quickly around the globe, and so it behooves us to be able to move resistance in the same kind of globalized, interactive, cross-generational way. For some people who say that the problem of intersectionality is that it's an identity politic, no, the problem is it's resisting an identity politic, the identity behind power. That's what the argument is all about. Intersectionality is not so much a thing, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of organizing. It's a way of moving. So think of intersectionality as more like a verb than a thing, more like a practice than a grand theory that predicts everything, more like a tool rather than something that's on automatic.
How does it relate to you?
Well, I think it relates to my reality, first of all, and that's, I think, the first and foremost important thing, that, you know, being a black woman, being a queer woman, being an African, you know, my parents are from Liberia, woman, so a refugee, having a refugee status, that these intersections, sort of, the intersectionality is about me, it's about my intersection. When we're talking about these oppressive systems, we're talking about actual people that benefit from them, and also actual people that suffer from them. If the life expectancy of a trans woman, a black trans woman of color, is 35 years, she's not going to spend those 35 years thinking about, you know, how it's theoreticized. And so I think what I really sort of try to do, and want to do with all of you, and with particularly you, Professor Crenshaw, is talk about how these theories can work for us in practice.
I agree with Clarice with regards to making it an inclusive conversation, and then also not dismissing. What I feel like we often do is dismiss somebody who doesn't have the language to vocalize what they mean. So their entire practice can be about intersectionality, but they lack the language, and then we dismiss them. And I think that's a very powerful point to raise, like to be mindful of that, to not exclude people. Yeah.
So I guess I want to talk a little bit about what do we call that, dismissal, or I guess affirm what you're saying, and at the same time resist a little bit the idea that intersectionality is an academic concept. So for one, academia certainly don't think so. That's the history that I'm most interested in. Like, how is it that a concept never finds a home anywhere? Because it sure ain't at home in the academy. And it doesn't seem to be at home in the spaces that actually reflect those projects and people who are doing intersectional practice. So what are we talking about then when we say it's an academic term? I think what we're talking about is a tendency that sometimes we have to dismiss people who don't use our language, but that doesn't necessarily mean the language is academic, full stop. I actually think that intersectionality doesn't appear to be as academic to some people because it actually is a word picture. It draws from everyday environments. We can map onto the fact that we all know what an intersection is. We use it as a metaphor for thinking about power. That's what it is. It's a metaphor. And I think people use metaphors in everyday life all the time. Right. So there's a difference between saying that if you don't use intersectionality as a word, you're not being intersectional. I think that's silly. But I also think that people get the concept of a lot of stuff is coming at me at the same time, and it's impacting me differently than it might impact, you know, my brother or my husband or whoever.
I think it's important that stresses the point of creating also our own work, which is a bit like corpus of feces, because even, because I understand what you're saying, Professor Crenshaw, when you say, we know what intersection means, but for a lot of people maybe don't speak English in a Dutch context. It's important to have a book that says, oh, kruispunt denken. Because I'm not sure if my great auntie would understand the word intersection, but she would understand the word kruispunt. So like a call for people, like produce work. Like we read a lot of stuff and produce. If you don't find a publisher, maybe you can self-publish. But these are such important concepts if you want to create more access. Also think about the languages that you're speaking in.
I'm thinking a lot about this idea of like belonging. And so much of sort of Black feminist thought is formed in the US in an African American perspective, often sort of devout of nationalism, because like African Americans, where are we gonna go? Like you can't say, go back to where you came from to a lot of African Americans because that's just not a possibility. So then I guess my question is speculative. Like when you think about Europe, where it's still so easy to fall back on this idea of, no, you're from Suriname, it's a different issue, no, you're from here. Like what happens in the future when we are 6 generations in or more and you're just German and happen to be Black, or just this and happen to be Swedish? Like what do you guys think? Do you think the conversation will change? Like are you hopeful about it? Just on the basis of like not being able to like use nationalism as a scapegoat.
Interesting question, because, well, for me, I can only speak for my specific situation. I think it's an interesting question because myself and people like me are technically Dutch and have been Dutch for a long time because of colonialism. So I think that a time at which you are both Dutch and a colonial subject, and those things make sense together and are not a question of power and of oppression, I don't think that will come. We spoke actually recently at Patricia's evening about assimilation as well, and about Blackness and being European, going as far back as the 1930s. We talked about negritude, and this question also came up, and I think that my answer is just the same, that assimilation will not happen. And to just stand firm, I would say, in ancestral identity and solidarity with people that are likewise oppressed, rather than waiting for something that will not happen. And then ultimately also I think why would you want to be part of this national identity when that by definition excludes people like you, has always dehumanized you, and when it embraces you with one arm, excludes your brothers and sisters with the other.
As you know, Claudia Jones invented the term triple oppression already in the 40s. And then we had the Combahee River Collective. I think they were in the 70s also writing about intersectionality. And I think around about the 80s, I'm not sure about the dates, it was Patricia Hill Collins also writing about intersectionality. I'm curious how you were influenced by them, and what you maybe added to intersectionality, to the term intersectionality, which maybe made it more contemporary or different. I'm just curious about how you were influenced.
Part of the story I try to tell in the book is how the 60s, the 70s created a rhetoric of talking back to power. And that rhetoric of talking back was a continuous rhetoric that stretched in African American history back to pre-slavery days. It generated a variety of voices. We already heard about Sojourner Truth, but other women who were talking back to both the logics of anti-Black racism, the logics of slavery, and the logics of patriarchy. So that's very much been part of traditions that have shaped activism and critical consciousness in our communities for centuries. Now, what was unique about the coming together of the voices that have been lifted up in the 60s and 70s is, once again, there were active movements in which these ideas were situated. So it's not simply the experience, but making relevant the critique of that experience in a moment where people are being activated and mobilized. So I talk about coming to age as a girl and as a teenager in periods of time where there was a notion of a we, and this is some part of the geography question. It was happening in that particular point where, yes, there wasn't really an option of, we'll take your stuff and go back to where you came from, right? We didn't ask to be here. So it was clear that it was within the nation-state discourse that we were making particular kinds of claims. But the failure of gender to shape the claim, or the failure of race to shape a gender claim, was not only part of the experience, but it was part of how law was rationalizing a status quo that was deeply unequal. And that was something that was relatively buried. So the voices that I would bring to the mix are voices like Polly Murray, who was a Black woman. People don't know her, right? But Polly Murray was a thinker who was both a significant theorist in the move to dismantle racial segregation. So she wrote a paper that became part of the brief on Brown versus Board of Education. Why don't we know her? We don't know her because the deep-rooted patriarchy that existed within civil rights lawyers' practices. She also was a person who theorized the effort to dismantle gender discrimination in the law. So her argument that gender discrimination and race discrimination were parallel was fundamental to mainstream anti-discrimination law. Why don't we know her? Why isn't she part of the feminist icons? She is a Black woman. Let me go further. She was probably also a trans woman, at least a trans man. At least she thought that there was some way that she wasn't a woman as women are thought to be. But there was no language for that at the time. So her thinking is foundational to a lot of stuff, right? But it was in the law. And so the law, she helped us think about how law is not simply a bystander. Law actually creates race. It creates the categories that then rule our lives. So intersectionality comes out of thinking about law's role in creating triple marginalization, law's role in insulating white supremacy and colonialism and patriarchy. So it was paying attention to what law did, not just what it didn't do, what it actually created. So that's where the word picture comes out of. It's trying to talk to judges and legal advocates and other people who have a partial view about discrimination, but their partial view actually creates violence across the range of ways that people experience discrimination. Now, in terms of other people who were really influential to me, Bell Hooks was influential to me. Because Bell helped me think about the fact that anti-racism many times is patriarchal, right? It's not just patriarchy impacts us, but the resistance to racism being patriarchal impacts us.